Hello friends, welcome back to Bookshelves. Today I'm super excited to be bringing you another mid-year book freakout tag, and I cannot believe it is possibly halfway through the year and time to make this video. I don't know about you, but this year has really flown by for me, and as I sat down to kind of prep for this video, I took a look at my story graph and found that I'd read about 26 books in the first half of the year. But I think I've only done one reading wrap up this year, and that was in January. So most of the books we're going to talk about today are books that I haven't had the chance to tell you about, and I'm really excited to do that. Let's go ahead and jump in. So question number one is, what is the best book you've read thus far in 2024? And while I've read several 5-star books, I think the one that brings me the most just like pure unadulterated joy was A Season for Scandal. This story is one that I have already raved about on the channel, and I actually have a reading vlog of the experience of picking this book up. So I will link that above, and I'll keep this brief. A Season for Scandal is a second book in a series. It's a historical romance novel that follows a sort of secret society of women who are basically operating their own like private investigator team. This group, called the Aviary, take on jobs for women and handle them exclusively with women, typically doing work for women who, for example, believe their husbands are perhaps stealing their family fortune or having an affair. Perhaps they want to leave and need leverage to do so. It is just so much fun. It's as if a Regency romance novel had a baby with a spy book, and it makes these books completely unputdownable. I really loved the leading lady in this book, and really enjoyed it just as much as the first one. I think it'd be an excellent summer read. So if you are looking for an absolute page turner, this book would be an absolutely top-notch recommendation. I will flag that there are some themes around domestic violence in this book, so just go in knowing that and make sure that you're taking care if that's something that might impact you. For the best sequel I've read thus far this year, although Season for Scandal would kind of fall into that category, it's not a true sequel, but it is a second book in a series. I would have to say Emily Wilde's Map of the Otherlands takes this spot hands down. I actually read both books 1 and 2 in the Emily Wilde series this year, and just could not get over how much I love Emily as a main character, her dynamic with Wendell, and this was a sequel that did not disappoint, and I don't think I would characterize it as having suffered from that middle book syndrome. As we know, this is going to ultimately be a trilogy. It really stood on its own. It had interesting themes, interesting plot, and really built on all of the fun and playfulness that exists in the character relationships that we got to build in the first book. If you liked the first book, you'll like the second one, hands down. It really preserved all of the things I loved most about this story, and I cannot wait for the third book to come out next year. If you haven't heard anything about Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies or Map of the Otherlands, it's sort of a light academia historical fantasy story that follows a professor at Oxford who studies dryadology, which is like the study of real life folklore and fairies, and her, many adventures in writing different academic papers about certain fairy-based issues. So it typically takes her away from home to study fae in the field, and involves a lot of playfulness with the ideas around academia, colleague relationships, getting to know the villagers in the area where she's staying. And the book is always littered with footnotes, which just really adds to this sort of feeling that we're in a very like academic state of mind while reading. So they're just an absolute blast, and I would highly recommend. For an anticipated release that I haven't picked up yet, I think this is probably supposed to be one that's already out, but I do have my sights set on a book that comes out later this month. It's called Queen Bee by Juno Dawson, and I cannot wait to pick it up. It is the third in the Her Majesty's Royal Coven series, which is a fantastic modern contemporary book series, kind of urban fantasy, I would say. It follows the coven of witches in London that sort of work for the government and were founded by Queen Anne Boleyn all those years ago. And so this third installment takes us away from our modern timeline, which is a shame because it left off on a real cliffhanger. And it's sending us all the way back to the foundation of Her Majesty's Royal Coven with the story of Queen Anne Boleyn, who I'm not sure if she was a witch or she was just a fan of witches. I think the premise is going to be that she was a witch herself. But that is a book I cannot wait to pick up this summer. Looking a little further out into the second half of the year for other anticipated releases, I think the next top on my list is the second book in the Davenports series, which I believe is going to be called More Than This by Crystal Marquis. These are historical romance books that follow a very wealthy Black family in Chicago in the turn of the century, and all of their sort of different romance lives and their personal goals, even outside of those love lives. They are so much fun. I loved the first book. It again left off on quite a cliffhanger. And the second one, I think, will take us in really interesting directions. Each character in this book felt like their own full person. They had problems and dreams that were entirely unrelated to their love life. And this meant that the book got to touch on some really great themes around like civil rights and business ownership and misogyny and whether or not women were allowed in certain workspaces. So I think they just really do a good job of balancing romance and those like warm butterfly feelings with other big themes from the time. And I believe this book was supposed to come out earlier this year and had its release date pushed back until November. So I have been eagerly awaiting, and I will continue to patiently wait for this next installment, where everybody was left on a very kind of unexpected note. And I'm really jazzed to see what's next for all of the girls. For the biggest disappointment thus far this year, I kind of have two different answers. Unfortunately, first and foremost is A Tempest of Tea. I was desperate to love this book. It had all of the right ingredients. It was a very hyped book prior to its release. It was on my anticipated releases list, and I believe many, many other people's. It's an urban fantasy story. We follow a sort of streetwise woman who runs a tea house that doubles as a blood house for vampires in the evening. And something about her tea house is at risk, so she has to put together a crew and heist to kind of stop that tea house sale. I wanted to love this so much. It's hard to put my finger exactly on what I didn't like so much about this story. I think for me, I was really regularly finding myself wondering, why are we doing this again? Like, for some reason, the sort of plot beats that lead to the heist just really weren't sticking in my brain. I had a very hard time thinking about, who were all the players, where were we going, and sort of why we were heisting in the way that we were heisting. I think that was the biggest one. And then I love a book that has themes around things like colonialism, for example, which this one did, but I felt like all of those themes were just really heavy-handed. And they were coming from characters who I knew I was supposed to love, but I just didn't really have any affection for. I didn't really feel like I knew these characters very well. And so that combination of being like a little dense, a little heavy-handed with the thematic stuff and feeling a little like distance from our primary perspectives just meant that I was confused and I wasn't really invested. And so I made it about halfway through the book before I decided not to finish it. I was so bummed to put it down, but I also know that there are so many books I want to read that if it's not connecting with me, it's not worth it. I can just put it down and move on with my life. The other book that comes to mind for disappointments is the first book in the Dresden Files series, which is called Stormfront. I had heard of Dresden Files like in the larger zeitgeist in passing before without really knowing a lot about what it was. And this year, I had started to see Murphy Napier talk a lot about the Dresden File books. And when she described them as following a wizard detective in Chicago, I was like, yes, please. That's exactly like the kind of book I would be interested in. I love magic. I love detective stories. I live in Chicago and love all things Chicago. But these books, at least this first one, was just like dripping in sexism, and like every female character in the book was really heavily sexualized. The way they were characterized, the interactions that happened, like just every part of it felt icky to me. And the book series started in, I think, the year 2000. So it like literally is a little old and outdated. It's written by a male author. And I get that thematically, like, noir novels often have that very sort of like sultry feeling to them. But it was a lot and I really disliked it. So I finished the book. I have a hold on the second one in the library. I'm going to give another one a shot because I want to like it so much. And I think there are lots of things about the world in the Dresden Files that could be really interesting. But if that kind of language continues, I don't think I'm going to be able to pick up any more of them. I'm giving another one a shot because the plot of this first book was very tied to sex. And so there's a chance that like maybe it was just heavy-handed because of the sort of plot connections. We'll see. But at the moment, I'm a little skeptical. And I was definitely disappointed to find just how dated and kind of like gross it felt. For the most surprising book I've read thus far this year, I think for me, this is Exit Strategy, which is the fourth novella in the Murderbot Diaries. Murderbot is a story that you may have already heard other people characterize. It's very popular here on BookTube. It is a sci-fi series largely comprised of novellas that follows a murderbot. Murderbot is a sort of sentient security robot that kind of breaks out of its official code and becomes like its own person. And at the start of the series, it's kind of like living in hiding, does not want anyone to find out that it is just a robot that wants to like watch dramas on TV and like not really talk to humans. Very like introverted and easily embarrassed and anxious, like a very funny and endearing character. That's meant to be, I think, like very relatable to the audience. And at the time they were on this mission to provide security for a research team, things go wrong on this journey, and that is the prompt that kind of kicks off the rest of the series. And I have enjoyed these books. I have found them to be fun, very easy listening. Murderbot is an endearing character, but I haven't been like blown away by any of the books. I think up until Exit Strategy, felt strongly that the first book was substantially better than the following books. But Exit Strategy just had this feeling of like homecoming. I won't share too much about the plot, but it does kind of involve Murderbot having gone on a bit of a journey of self-discovery thus far in the series and choosing to come back to some people in their life who they had sort of walked away from earlier in the books. And that really got me. I really felt so much more invested in this version of the story than I had in the last several books. And I think I gave it a substantially higher rating than the others. So I was really, really delighted with Exit Strategy, and it felt like it had really good payoff this far into the series to get to see Murderbot in kind of their newer, truer form alongside some of the people who they care about. Who is my new favorite author? I think this year has been like the year of T. Kingfisher for me. I've heard T. Kingfisher described plenty on the internet over the past few years, and I've always been quite confident that I would love her books if I read them. I just hadn't read them yet. And I was very pleased to find that most of her books are on Everand, if not all of them, actually. And so over the winter and spring of this year, I just gobbled up a bunch of her backlog. I read Nettle and Bone, A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking, Thorn Hedge, and I'm currently making my way through her fantasy romance series called the Saint of Steel series. And she's just fantastic. I have loved all of her books. They're not always like 5-star reads, but I think that she has such a distinct and playful voice. Like, she knows fantasy so well, and she takes these sort of tropes and expectations that we have about these sort of traditional high fantasy settings, and she just goofs with them in a way that feels so unique and fresh, and in many ways, like, obvious. Like, oh, of course that would happen if we, like, thought about this for a while. So they just, I think, really carve out a great niche in the fantasy genre. And they are so funny. Like, T. Kingfisher is a hilarious author, and that humor means that even when she's writing about darker themes, there is still such levity and absurdity to the story that really creates like a nice alleviation to balance out the reading experience. I just find her characters and her voice now, having read several of her books, to be very endearing. And although I wouldn't necessarily say her books are like truly cozy fantasy, I've started to find that they feel cozy to me. Which is such a great sign. I would highly recommend T. Kingfisher, especially if, like me, you've been sitting on the opportunity to read her books for a while. Okay, I always have a hard time with who is your new fictional crush. And I think last year I did this as well. I'm gonna cop out a little bit and pick a character from one of the manga series I'm reading that is cute. And that is where my crush is coming from. But this year I started reading a new manga series called The Fox and Little Tanuki. And it follows this fox who used to be this incredible sort of trickster god who was defeated and imprisoned and their sort of godhood taken away. And they're now being tested to kind of get some of their power back and to be reintegrated into the world. And the test is that they have to take care of this little tanuki who is showing some aptitude for magic and kind of guide this little tanuki into adulthood and into a practice of magic safely and kindly. And it's just hysterical. But little Tanuki is just adorable. I'll insert some footage here of the art style, but the dynamic between the two of them is adorable, and obviously little Tanuki is very cute as well. So that has been a great source of joy in my life, and little Tanuki definitely has just a little bit of my heart. For a new favorite character, I think I would have to say is Willoughby from The Hexologists. The Hexologists is another book that I've described at least a bit in a reading vlog, so I'll be sure to plug that here. But the essence of the story is that The Hexologist is kind of an urban fantasy story. It feels very like 1920s adjacent, and it follows a married couple, Iz and Warren Wilby, who are hexologists. So they use symbols to cast some forms of magic, and they have a large collection of magical objects that they use to investigate magical crimes. And their dynamic as a couple is so funny and endearing and wonderful. It's so nice to see a couple that is married and like still very much in love, as opposed to following a story where somebody falls in love. But also just to see such like a happy, healthy couple. Like they are peak relationship goals. Iz is a very like steely main character. She's very clever, she's very stubborn, and she's really darn good at her job. And I just absolutely loved reading from her perspective and seeing her kind of navigate social situations where she just is like not gonna make room for the other person and their nonsense. You know, she's very direct, and that creates lots of really funny dynamics. So Wilby is somebody who I want to be when I grow up. For a book that made me cry, I think I would have to say Spinning Silver. And I can't recall if I actually like shed tears reading this book, but it was fantastic, absolutely beautifully written, another 5-star read for me. The basic premise is that we are in a historical setting. It's very cold. I don't know if it's meant to actually be Russia, but fantasy Russia adjacent. And it follows a Jewish girl whose father is a moneylender. He's a very bad moneylender. And that means her family's very poor. And so one day she gets kind of tired of living in such circumstances, and she takes over the family business, and she's really good at it. And one day while traveling through the woods, she brags that she can turn silver into gold. That statement is overheard by a Fey king, and then he starts knocking on her door, demanding that she literally turn silver into gold, and all kinds of things unravel from there. But it is a book that deals with really serious, really heavy themes. Lots of stuff in there about anti-Semitism, and lots of stuff in there about domestic abuse. And there are a couple scenes in this book that were so intense, so heavy, and you sit in these characters' perspectives as they struggle in the aftermath of really horrible events and try to survive. I would say it was really emotionally impactful and handled those really heavy subjects really, really well. For a book that made me happy, I feel like any number of books that I've already talked about could count here, but I want to give you a unique answer. So I think what I might say is Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. And hear me out, it's not because somebody died, but I this winter read a series of Agatha Christie books, all of which have modern movie adaptations. And so I really enjoyed the experience of consuming this story as written by Christie, and then sitting down with my husband and getting to watch the movie and, seeing all the things that were different and what was kept the same. And they're like very star-studded cast, so it was fun to like see who was pulled in to make the movie, and they're just really visually stunning. So I had a lot of fun kind of pairing the book and movie together. I would like read the book over the course of a week, and then that weekend we'd watch the movie, and we did that for almost a month. I think I did it for 3 books in a row. So that process brought me a lot of joy. I think it also really reminded me of the value of books and movies as separate forms of media, but they can be really fun to put in conversation with each other, right? Like, is the book better than the movie is one way to approach that, but it can also just be, how was the movie handled of this story? Do I like this story in this art form and the changes they made for the art form, Anyway, it was a lot of fun. Would recommend. Most beautiful book that I read this year, I think, is probably Atalanta. And that is a Greek retelling. Unsurprisingly, I think some of the most beautiful books in my collection are Greek retelling stories. Atalanta follows the tale of Atalanta, who was a princess born to a king who wanted a son and was left on a mountainside to die, but was spared by Artemis, who sent a bear to raise her as one of their own. So she was raised by bears, and then when she became a teenager, was taken into Artemis's a collection of huntresses and forest spirits. And she was ultimately sent to be the only female Argonaut with Jason on the Argo, and is a big part of his myth. So we cover lots of really interesting territory with that story arc. And the book itself is gorgeous. I'll make sure to insert a photo here, but it's got lovely gold foiling and lots of beautiful, beautiful sort of Greek designs. So Loved the way that one looked. And last but not least is, what is a book that you have to read by the end of the year? I have had my eyes on a couple of books about Iceland recently because I am going on my honeymoon to Iceland later this year. I think it would be really fun to read some books in that setting, either before we go or like while we're there. So I'd really love to read Burial Rites, and I'm not sure who wrote it off the top of my head, so I'll be sure to add that information here. But I think it will be a great way to sort of prepare myself to really enjoy our visit just that little bit more. Burial Rites, to my understanding, is the story of the last woman to be put to death in Iceland. I believe she's basically waiting at home on house arrest for the determination to come from Denmark, maybe, about whether or not she will be put to death. And so we see her and just really sit with her in that period of waiting. It's based on a true story, and I'd love to have that little piece of history as I go into my trip. So that's it. There's my mid-year book Freakout tag. I'd love to know, what was the best book you read in the first half of the year? What are you dying to pick up next? If you have a video like this tag, please add it down below. I'd love to come and see. And I will see you all in my next one. Bye.